Welcome to episode 11 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. I'm here with Zach and Jake, and we have a few questions lined up that we're going to tackle here in a second. Before we get started here, we just want to again say thank you to everybody that's been listening, that's been sharing the podcast around. We're quite pleased that more than about two people are listening. So again, we're encouraged to keep going. We're getting some good feedback from you guys. Special shout out to Will Berkman from the Weekly Weights podcast. He was giving us some audio advice. We're on episode 11 here, so maybe by episode 50 to 100, the audio will have improved. We're slowly but surely working on it in the background. But again, thank you to everybody that's been listening, leaving ratings and reviews. So yeah, with that, we will jump into the first question here. Zach, I'm going to pass this one to you. So the question is, in your RPE/RIR guide, which for those of you that don't know, in our bios on Instagram, we have a link where you can download our free RPE/RIR guide for strength and hypertrophy. So just a little bit of context on this question. So we kind of outlined two protocols that we suggested will probably give pretty similar hypertrophy. So the first protocol is 3 sets of 8 at 2 reps in reserve. So 3 sets of 8 with about your 10 rep max. And the second protocol is 6 sets of 4 at 6 reps in reserve. So again, that's about your 10 rep max, but you're just kind of breaking the work up into more sets. So again, between these two protocols, you're using the same load, right? The same percentage of your 1 rep max, and you're performing 24 reps in each protocol, but again, just breaking the work up into more sets. So the question goes on to say, what do you think about the concept that one needs to perform at least 5 reps per set for that set to drive muscle hypertrophy? So i.e. the concept that a certain volume within a set to stimulate hypertrophy, not just a certain volume per session/week for a certain muscle group. And then they go on to say, thank you for the podcast. It's amazing so far. And to that we say, thank you right back. And we appreciate the kind words. So Zach, I'll throw it to you and you can start to tackle that question.
Yeah, so I think this is a good question. I think kind of the way I'm going to frame my answer is kind of dichotomizing efficiency versus efficacy. So I think, first and foremost, I don't think it's necessary to have a set that's 5 reps or more to be stimulated for hypertrophy. I think that's pretty well established in the literature. The classic study would be the kind of high rep versus low rep DUP study that compared, kind of training in the more hypertrophy, centered rep range, 8 to 12 or whatever, versus training that was in the 2 to 6 rep range. So they have one day there that's over that 5 rep cutoff, but 2 that aren't. And they equated total relative volume, and they saw essentially the same muscle growth. So that is pretty strong evidence, and there's a ton of other studies that would suggest similar findings, that so long as volume is equated, you can have sets that are below 5 repetitions and see the same muscle growth. Now, where this question gets a little bit more interesting, in my opinion, is how it impacts per set efficiency. So if we're looking at a protocol where we are going to do 3 sets of volume, after a top set or something on squats, that's where I think you can make a case that, sets over 5 repetitions, if we keep the RPE the same. So let's say we're doing sets at an 8 RPE. So one person does, or the same individual does 3 sets of 8 at an 8 RPE versus another person, or the same individual doing 3 sets of 3 at an 8 RPE. So 3 sets of 8 versus 3 sets of 3. In that example, I think the person doing 3 sets of 8 would see quite a bit more muscle growth, just because on a per set basis, I think that the higher repetitions are going to be slightly more efficient. That's not to say that they're more efficacious, though, and this is where I would say, if you're going to allow volume to be equated, which means the lower rep condition will just have more sets, kind of like we're advocating here in this example. In our example, again, the protocols were 3 sets of 8 versus 6 sets of 4, and not 3 sets of 4. I think that's where the differences would go away, especially if the load is greater than 75% of 1RM, where we think pretty much every rep is quote unquote effective. So that would be kind of the answer that comes off of my head. So just to recap, inherently, there's nothing that says a low rep set can't be stimulative hypertrophy. And as long as relative volume is equated, which generally means you're going to be performing a few more sets with low rep sets, I think you can see the same muscle growth so long as those conditions are met. So again, efficiency versus efficacy.
I will just throw one thing in here too, that there's a time and place for both, right? Like depending on whatever, like if you have time constraints, then maybe doing the higher rep stuff is more useful. I think there's also a benefit to having those exposures to high RPEs just in terms of being able to gauge those more accurately. If we're always doing things in that 6 reps in reserve range, it just like eventually you start to second guess, like, is this actually 6 reps in reserve, right? Whereas if we're kind of closer to failure, at least sometimes, then you can have a better idea. Um, Versus like somebody who maybe they get really beat up from going to high RPEs, but time isn't really an issue, then for them, the time efficiency isn't a big factor. So we can just do more sets at a lower RPE, that kind of thing. So I think that's just yet another example of where individualization, not just to the person, but to their specific constraints at that time, can really come into play.
Yeah, two things just to add on that quickly, Jake. Those are great additions. The first would be that kind of the low RPE approach does make one assumption, and I think it's a safe assumption, but it is an assumption nonetheless. Is that metabolic stress? While we do not think that's a primary driver of hypertrophy, it's going to essentially eliminate that almost completely. So, if there is some benefits to metabolic stress, whether that be short term, long term, or like a potentiatory effect, um, those are kind of eliminated. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that you're probably going to want to have some higher RPE sets for hypertrophy at some point in time, just to make sure you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. The other thing I was going to say is, just like Jake said, these protocols are paramount that the load is greater than 75% of 1 rep. All of our arguments kind of go out the window if that load is not correct. So Jake's point about accuracy is extremely, extremely well taken. If you're not training with a load that's greater than your 12 RM or so, I think our confidence and your ability to have those higher RAR protocols and get the same muscle growth starts to be severely diminished. So it's really, really important that you spend some time, whether it's a block or two before you go to this lower fatigue approach, or maybe it's some session within the same block, in spending some sets that make damn sure that you're training with 12 RM or greater loads, which is probably going to be some type of tester set, like Jake said, where you're going to be training with like that 6 to 10 rep range at a pretty high RP, just to be very, very confident you know where that kind of 10 RM load cutoff is, so that when you are doing these lower fatigue protocols, you can be confident that the load is appropriate to do so. Josh, what do you got there to tie things up?
I think I wrote some notes down as you guys were talking, and you guys kind of covered everything. Um, to kind of go off of what you were just saying, Zach, um, to like ensure that the load is sufficient, it is probably a good idea to have some sort of indicator so that you can keep up with progress, if that makes sense. Because if you make the assumption that whatever 300 pounds is 75% of your 1RM in week 4, like how sure of that can you be? So there's kind of two ways to do that. The first way is to use some sort of lower rep, higher RPE top set to get a pretty accurate gauge of your estimated 1RM for the day. And another thing that we would do is like give some sort of tester set, or like kind of a way to kick off that exercise slot that is going to have a greater RIR accuracy. So for example, sometimes I'll give somebody like the first set is a set of 6 to 8 at RP 7. Most people can be pretty dang accurate with that. And then, let's say they do a set of 7 at RP 7. Okay, we just found their 10 rep max load for the day. And we can be pretty confident that that load is indeed heavy enough. And then we can keep that same load and just do a bunch of triples with it. So, again, Jake, excellent point. And then you just, kind of use some programming strategies to ensure that you're checking that box of sufficient loading, and that, like you said, you're not ending up doing 15 RAR sets, which we're definitely not advocating for. We're just saying that, to kind of go back to this question, that our working model as of now is that once the load is sufficient enough, a 10 to 12 RM load or heavier, a rep is kind of a rep for hypertrophy. Are we 100% certain of that? No, and that's why we periodize things and we ensure that there are blocks of training where metabolic stress is rather high, because this question was kind of framed in a way that okay, I see what you guys are saying about per session volume, but is there something to the volume within the set itself? Is there a threshold of intercept fatigue necessary to maximize muscle growth? And to that, I'd say no, if the load is sufficient. If the load is insufficient, then yes, you need metabolic stress to put sufficient tension on the higher threshold motor units, or I should say the higher threshold muscle fibers. Um, so yeah, to kind of tie things up, once the load is sufficient, there isn't necessarily, you're not relying on metabolic stress to get the tension on the fibers we're trying to grow. Something I want to throw back to you guys is, do you think there's a benefit to varying rep ranges in general? So let's just frame this for hypertrophy, because of course for strength we want to have a good amount of lower rep sets, to practice the strength of the skill of strength. But just generally speaking, for hypertrophy, do you guys think there's a benefit to exposing yourself to a wide range of number of reps per set within a given training block?
I'm going to take this first, and I'm going to wave the speculation flag pretty high here. This is kind of a theory I've had for a little bit of time now, but again, I don't know how strongly I can state this at all. So again, speculation flag is waved. Caution with the statements I'm going to have. I would say, based on the literature that we have right now, I don't think there's sufficient evidence to say that changing repetition ranges or changing loading ranges has a huge effect on hypertrophy. I think the one caveat there is psychologically that can be super beneficial to make sure you're not doing the exact same thing every day. Improves training intent, improves focus, which ultimately we think is going to probably lead to better outcomes. But physiologically, I don't think there's a good rationale. Like, for example, all the data we have on fiber type specific hypertrophy, I don't think is convincing to say that different loading ranges will stimulate one type of fiber growth better than the other. There's a couple outlier studies there. The Bjornsson study is one that people throw around all the time. But what I would say is the primary factor there, and again, I apologize for always coming back to the topic of proximity to failure, but my opinion is that different fiber types can probably be hypertrophied in different relative amounts depending how close you are training to failure. So I think if you train considerably closer to failure, I think there's a chance that is going to be related to more slow twitch fiber growth, and if you train farther from failure, that would be related to more fast twitch growth. Again, with the caveat being that the load has to be heavy enough for those motor units to be recruited in the first place. But that would be, to me, is the rationale for kind of an undulating periodization approach. But I think it comes more from the proximity to failure end rather than the loading end, in my opinion. So Jake, I don't know if you disagree or have anything to tie in on that. Again, speculation flag wave. That's totally just something I kind of. I'm just.
I want to pause there for a quick second. Because typically what people will say is that as you approach failure, the higher threshold motor units cycle in. And what Zach just kind of said is the opposite of that. And this, again, is kind of our working model right now, what Zach said. But we're not sure. Trying to read the
speculation.
Yeah. Our understanding of motor unit physiology is not excellent. And our understanding is also that the experts of the experts in this field, they're not entirely sure either. And then, we're 10 steps down the ladder of this.
Right.
So, but what Zach is saying is that, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the load is heavy enough and if the highest threshold motor units are the most fatigable, why would they be the last to drop out? That's kind of what it comes down to. So
dropout is a theoretical term, just to be totally clear. Yes. So dropout is in quotes. What Josh is saying is to the point where the motor unit is producing considerably less force.
Stuff is very, very speculative. We cannot emphasize that enough.
Totally unrehearsed conversation right now.
And also, if the load is low, like the reason you can get pretty good growth or actually maximize growth per set with lower loads, let's say 40 or 50% of 1RM, is because the higher threshold fibers do cycle in as the intercept fatigue builds. But we're saying if those higher threshold fibers are necessary right off the bat, they're going to experience sufficient tension right away. And again, we kind of think maximize tension. More caveats coming.
Yeah, two caveats. First and foremost, the Henneman size principle is still respected. We're not saying that it's not respected. The low threshold motor units come in first, higher threshold motor units come in after. We're just saying with a sufficiently heavy load, that ramp up process happens very, very quickly, almost simultaneously on the first rep. The second thing to caveat is that recruitment of a motor unit is not the only thing that matters for the stimulus. The second thing that people will often say is that, okay, yes, with a heavy enough load, you will recruit a high threshold motor unit, but it's not going to reach maximal firing rates, which also has implications for the mechanical tension placed upon a muscle fiber, which is a fair caveat. And again, I'm not going to go too far down into the weeds here, but all I'm saying is based on the data I've seen, and here we usually like to take the approach of taking the longitudinal outcomes that we have and trying to shape a model around the longitudinal outcomes. Mechanisms are great and they're what science is built upon, but at the end of the day, it's very, very hard to just take mechanistic speculation and apply that to longitudinal outcomes. So we kind of usually like to make models in the reverse direction, which definitely has limitations, to be clear. But that's kind of where we've kind of operated this model. We take some of the kind of more mechanistic motor unit data, specifically if you want to read a really good review paper on this, is a paper by Potvin. It's a computer modeling paper of motor units in skeletal muscle. It's really, really good. It's very high level, and I don't understand all of it, but it's a good thing to read. But we take some of that and then we apply it with the more longitudinal outcomes and kind of see if we can make sense of things. And my kind of opinions on this, like I said, have come more so from looking at the longitudinal stuff. And I was like, how can we make sense of this on the back end mechanistically with the principles that we have from basic physiology? So this is a conversation that we probably shouldn't have delved too much into, but go ahead, Josh.
No, man, I like this. Jake, go for it, man.
I have one thing I want to throw in here, just because I know somebody's going to throw out the Schoenfeld study from a few years ago, where they had one group doing. I actually pulled it up because I want to make sure I got the rep ranges correct. The one group did 8 to 12 RM for 3 sets per exercise 3 times a week. Another group did 3 sets per exercise still. One day they did a 2 to 4 RM. Another day they did 8 to 12 RM. And then the third day they did a 20 to 30 RM. Everything was to failure. And at the end of the day, effect sizes for hypertrophy tended to favor the group that was doing various rep ranges. So I know a lot of people are going to bring that up as like, well, the study said, right? But kind of going along with some of the stuff that we've said before and sort of our big picture thinking on a lot of this type of research is that it is, number one, questionable on did they actually go to failure on the 20 to 30 RM. But anyway, methodology aside, just the enjoyment and the intent and just breaking things up and doing a different thing throughout the week, like Zach was saying earlier, is most likely what's driving that, right? Like they're just training harder. And with the light skepticism, I will say, that a lot of these failure studies are actually going to failure, right? That if we're staying shy of failure so much in these protocols, that the people that are having more fun, having more intent, training harder are probably going to come out on top. So and
the other thing there too, Jake, just to pedal on that a little bit, is in general, what was the heaviest day there you said?
2 to 4 rep max.
So I would say in general, heavy loads are kind of foolproof. So even if you are not training to failure, like was reported in the protocol, which again, not saying anything fall about the protocol, it's just kind of a logistical reality of research sometimes. But even if you're training at a couple of reps and more reps in reserves than intended for this protocol, a 2 to 4 RM is going to be dummy proof, and it's going to be a heavy enough load that the repetitions in reserve are going to matter less. But if we're training at that 20 to 30 RM, like we've talked about, that's where the accuracy of the RIR becomes infinitely more important. But caveats aside there, and I think that same thing applies to the 8 to 12 RM, which is kind of where the other group might have always been short of failure, where this other group might have had one day where they were training with heavy enough loads that the RIR didn't matter as much. But the second thing I was going to say is that I also think there is something to be said if you're training with multiple repetition ranges. Some benefits to fatigue management potentially. So if the little that we know about fatigue, which I would still question the way that it's, not to say the way that it's studied, but what we're looking at, I think, doesn't always correlate to what we mean in practice all the time. But from what we know thus far, higher repetitions and closer to failure are going to be more fatiguing. So if you kind of balance that out with a few different sessions, so if you have that heavy session, that's going to be less repetitions, and it would be theoretically less fatiguing. I think that can help balance things out a little bit. But yeah, mechanistically, I don't think there's too much going on. I think it's mostly just psychologically, but that's just my 2 cents.
So Zach, I definitely agree about the psychological stuff. I guess I kind of want to examine this fatigue management part a little bit.
I didn't think through that hard enough. If it's bad, just rip it to shreds.
No. Just a very surface level thing. Would it be safe to? Is this a fair characterization of maybe what you were getting at? Is that perhaps with different rep ranges, there are different quote unquote mechanisms of fatigue, and thus if you're varying the routes at which you're getting to fatigue, you may have a greater volume tolerance, and thus you see slightly greater progress.
Yeah, I might have said that wrong now, because now I'm kind of revisiting what I just said. In theory, that would have been balanced out by the 20 to 30 RM day, because that's the highest rep closest to failure. So that would have been kind of balanced out the low rep day. But yeah, that's more along that's more along what I'm saying, is that like the 20 to 30 RM day is super, super low loading. So you're kind of getting an offloading from that perspective. And then if you have a very heavy load day, that you're kind of getting offloading from the repetition perspective or something like that. Again, pretty speculative. I'm not super convinced, but I'm just trying to play devil's advocate to myself to say that it's all psychological.
Yeah. One interesting thing that I'll throw out, because I haven't done this exact protocol, obviously, right? But I have experimented with doing things pretty drastically different rep ranges. And what I will say, like, all the research is suggesting that these really high rep ranges are more fatiguing, right? But I think when we actually do that stuff in the real world, like, will your strength output be lower the day after you do sets of 30 to failure? Yes, right? But number one, we're probably not maxing out the next day anyway. That wouldn't be smart. But in the sense of that fatigue management stuff you're talking about, it's certainly been my experience, and then some other people that I've talked to, at least more within the bodybuilding world, that doing sessions like that can actually help promote recovery, just because you're getting a break from the heavy loads in your joints, you're getting more blood flow, that kind of stuff. So my experience in practice has been a little bit different from what we see in the research. But so I just wanted to throw that in there, that like I'm not really ready to fully commit either way. And I think that, like, it's kind of like we talk about all the time, like we don't want to take something off the table, right? So like there's a time and place.
And I think one thing, and Josh, tell me if I'm wrong, I think you've looked into this literature a little bit better than I have, but in general, when they're testing that fatigue stuff, it's more akin to power outcomes in general. So if that's the case, I would say the kind of more endurance-y stuff is definitely going to affect that more than it would like kind of maximal strength or ability to do hypertrophy style training, which is generally what we care about, and probably even more so in the hypertrophy direction, which I think is going to affect even less. So yeah, that's just the caveat. So I think the fatigue literature is something we can go in on a later date, but that's a well taken point, Jake. We good on that one, boys?
I have a
let's go. Go for it.
I'm actually genuinely enjoying this conversation, and there was something, Zach, you talked about a few minutes ago that I figured we might as well just chat about while we're already like way off plan of this podcast. So what you mentioned, and I'm going to use our like low fatigue stuff as the example here, is that the way we came at our model of like the first reps of a set at a given load are where the majority of the strength stimulus is found, and kind of framing that through the lens of force production. You know, we looked at the longitudinal research examining proximity to failure for longitudinal strength gains, and then we worked backwards from there and said, okay, why is this the case? As opposed to the other way around of, okay, what do we expect? Now, I'm not saying that's a poor exercise when you're reading research to say, okay, what am I expecting here? But again, we kind of look at the longitudinal research, work backwards and say, okay, what's kind of our mental working model so that we can apply these concepts to practice? Because at the end of the day, we're not pulling protocols from research studies and just throwing them on our client spreadsheets. We want to take the concepts from the research and apply them, you know, for the athlete in front of us. So I guess just generally speaking, I wanted to kind of see if you guys want to chat about that a little bit, of like the utility of models in general, and like maybe we can even focus on our force production for this low fatigue training stuff, and like the benefits and drawbacks of having this model and kind of using that as a communication piece, etc. Because I have a hard time believing that like as many people would understand it if we were to just talk about the longitudinal research as opposed to, okay, this is the, the loose model, our loose working model. Like, I think a lot more people will grasp that. And from a science communication perspective, I think there might be benefits there, but maybe somebody could make a really hard, intellectual academic position that, oh, you only report the results of the study and that's all. So I guess I'll throw that as bait to you guys and see what you guys have to say about that, because I think it's an interesting conversation.
Jake, what do you got? You want to go first?
I mean, I could try. Like, really, I honestly think about it in a really general sense of like pretty much exactly what you said, Josh. Like, we're just taking the concept and trying to. It's honestly, I think it comes back to hearing Dr. Zordos on a podcast years ago, and like the first two words out of his mouth were conceptualize and integrate, and it's like that's just sort of a filter for a lot of this research stuff that we read about and we spend so much time learning, that like the actual protocol really doesn't matter that much once we figure out what the concept is. And like critiquing the study, yes, it matters, but in terms of applying it to clients, really we're just trying to get the concept out of it. So that's really about as deep as I have gone thinking through it. So Zach, maybe you have more to add there, but that's about all I got.
It's tough. I mean, obviously the bumper sticker quotes is all models are wrong, but some are useful. I mean, that's kind of the best general statement I can make, I think, is but I do think it's really important to kind of talk about that. Is like, we didn't go into writing that article, like kind of the whole reason we found that kind of the story of that low fatigue article is me and Josh were doing a data collection for more of the hypertrophy side of things, and kind of exploring the effective reps hypothesis. And so when we were looking at that research, Greg beat us to the punch and wrote an awesome article on the topic for hypertrophy. But when we were reading that research, we also kind of had a column in our data collection sheet about strength, and we just noticed that more often than not, the results were kind of the opposite of what we would have expected for strength than for hypertrophy. And that wasn't the focus of that kind of data collection. But then we kind of came back around to it and kind of looked at our literature collection sheet, and we're like, oh wow, this is interesting. And so then we kind of, like Josh said, we really collected all the data, kind of looked at the picture more holistically, and then we're like, okay, why does this make sense? Or like, what's the through line here that connects all of these findings? And that's how we kind of came up with this working model. And as I said in that bumper sticker quote, all models are flawed inherently. There's going to be new data that comes out that's going to add more color to our model. Maybe the effective load isn't a 10 RM and maybe it's an 8 RM. Maybe it's a 15 RM. I don't know. Or maybe there is another aspect to kind of some of the motor unit stuff that we discussed that kind of questions some of our underlying presuppositions, which is fine. And that's kind of how it goes. But with the data that we have right now, we're pretty confident in the way that we assembled that model. And so now the kind of the goal of that now is to take that model, and when new research comes out, does our model predict the results? And we continually update that with additional longitudinal outcomes that come on. And once another 10 studies come out and we have to kind of do this entire process again, hopefully our model can be a little bit more specific to what we're trying to answer and a little bit better. And that's just kind of how that process goes. And there's going to be inherent limitations to this. The model is inherently descriptive about very, very specific things. So force production and 1RM strength gain. There's a ton of other things that go into 1RM strength gain than just force production. You have volume. You have all of the psychological components that we mentioned that are completely ignored by the model. And that's an inherent limitation of it. But that doesn't make it completely useless. I think it's descriptive in a certain sense, and it's very, very helpful to describe what we see in the longitudinal outcomes, but doesn't make it perfect. And we're going to continue to refine it over time. And if we didn't, that'd be bad onus on our part. So I think that's kind of just our goal, is to continue to update it and refine it over time. Hopefully we're right. Hopefully we're more right than we were wrong. But we could be wrong about a lot of things. But that's kind of where my head goes. I would just stick with that bumper sticker quote and kind of roll with that. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, man, that's good. I'll stop I'll stop pointing us in certain directions because I've taken us down a long path. So I'll throw it to Zach or Jake, and they can make the appropriate call here.
All right. Yeah, we'll roll to the next question here. This one's from Mr. Jake. Jake, okay. So if you had two hypertrophy or strength blocks that you were going to run one after the other, so you have hypertrophy block 1, hypertrophy block 2. In terms of how those blocks look, what's the second block going to look like? Is it going to have more significant changes or like look significantly different than the first block, or is it going to be pretty similar with really really minor refinements in terms of the how it looks?
So I actually do this all the time. So I think this is a really good question, and it really is very individual, which is the most frustrating and unhelpful answer ever. But it just comes down to what sort of data are we collecting, both objectively and subjectively, and like how did this first block go? Did we identify any certain things that like, wow, this did not work? Like we need to do something else, right? Maybe that's as simple as the athlete was dealing with their quads were just obliterated all the time and their chest never felt like they were doing anything, right? Like then that's very simple. We need to probably do a little bit less quad work, maybe a little bit more chest work, right? So it's like just based on the feedback like that, we're making adjustments. And I think the magnitude of adjustment really just emerges from what we identified from sort of looking at that first block. So I think in almost all cases, it's going to be pretty small tweaks, because if you go in with a well thought out plan, we're probably in most cases not going to have these just massive things that just went wrong, right? And we're going to be adjusting week to week as we go anyway. So I think that in terms of hypertrophy blocks, at least, they tend to look pretty similar. I might adjust. Usually what I'm thinking long term is like we probably have a strength block coming relatively soon in the future, right? So I like to think of a lot of these. I think part of this question is thinking about potentiation, right? So I like to try to think about not just like, does this higher volume phase potentiate strength gain, but also do the exercise selection now, does the exercise selection now potentiate something in the future? So I like to think about maybe for squats, for example, maybe in the hypertrophy phases, they're doing just a lot of high bar squats, maybe a little bit of low bar here and there just to kind of keep technique crisp, but like it's a lot of high bar, it's a lot of these variations. Then as we get into like future blocks, maybe we switch to doing a tempo low bar squat or a pause low bar squat, something that's still a variation, still a little bit more hypertrophy friendly than just a normal competition squat, but it's closer, right? It's more specific. Then we get into that strength block, and now we're just hitting low bar squats, and now they have so much confidence because their technique is just so much more dialed in because they just were practicing low bar, but it was a slow tempo, right? So we can really take advantage of things like that. So I like to try to keep those things in mind. But really, I think that's really what it is trying to keep things pretty minimal tweaks if possible, because ideally the plan was intelligent to begin with. We've identified certain feedback, certain data that help us to see these little tweaks that need to be made. But if we are just overhauling everything, then it's just adding so much noise to the system, and we really can't know, like, was this block better than the last one? Maybe yes, maybe no, but why? We can't really say that if we have 10 different things that we did, right? So I think we're trying to find that balance is key, in my opinion. So I don't know if Josh, if you want to hop in there, if you got some more thoughts.
No, I think that's really 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 good, Jake. I definitely agree. I'm going to kind of directly answer this question first, and then go into hopefully what will not turn into a rant, kind of about periodization and individualization in general. So the question itself is, just to really simplify it, is okay, if you're going to design a training cycle where instead of just having a hypertrophy block and then a strength block, you have two hypertrophy blocks and then a strength block, or a single hypertrophy block and two single and then two strength blocks, right? Like, would those back-to-back hypertrophy or back-to-back strength blocks be the same thing? Would they be drastically different, etc.? So to directly answer that question, I would say that you should really just follow athlete psychology, and that's probably going to be the primary variable you're considering when making that decision. So, for example, well, to take a step back, at the end of the day, if we're running two hypertrophy blocks back to back, what is the goal of that? The goal of that is to spend more time maximizing the rate of hypertrophy progress. Um, so at the end of the day, if the training is well designed, we just need more weeks accumulating that good hypertrophy training. But if the individual feels like they need, if the individual has a hard time staying engaged with similar training for 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, then at that point you might want to make some small variations just for variation's sake. That's kind of a touchy subject. I think some individuals will kind of say like, "Oh, every single variation you choose, there should be a reason for it." While I agree, I think there's also times where you can change your deficit push-up to a machine chest press because at the end of the day, they're accomplishing a very similar goal. If they check all the boxes for that individual, and you change that single exercise from hypertrophy block 1 to hypertrophy block 2, and that keeps them more engaged, that's a net positive. So really to kind of wrap that up, I would just say follow athlete psychology, and that would really be the main thing. Now to kind of think about this question more broadly of when does it make sense to do 2 hypertrophy focused phases followed by 1 strength focused phase, or 1 hypertrophy focused phase followed by 2 strength focused phases. I've personally been starting to move away from this a little bit because what I've noticed, and I'd be curious to get your guys' take on this, is that the more variables we add in, the more options we add into the individualization process, the harder it is to actually detect what is going on. So, for that reason, I think there's a ton that we can individualize within a given proactive periodization model, and that we've talked about frequently, where, okay, we have a hypertrophy focused phase where we have higher intercept fatigue, higher average RPE, but slightly lower peak intensity. And then we transition to a strength focused phase with slightly higher peak intensity, lower intercept fatigue, lower average RPE, etc. There's so much that you can individualize within that and just repeat cycles and refine over time and eventually fall in a good training cycle for that individual. Where if you really start messing with that proactive periodization model a ton, it gets very, very hard to really have sufficient diagnostic clarity. So while I do that with some individuals, I don't think it's a huge deal to take a 4-week block and just, kind of make it non-specific, focus on varying exercises, etc. I'm kind of I kind of just take our proactive periodization model and then individualize within that, because there is so much stuff to mess around with, that I think if you start adding layers and layers, that it becomes difficult to actually detect what's going on. So ramble over. That's a long-winded way of saying largely focus on what is the goal, is to accumulate the time necessary for the adaptations, but then also the individualization considerations of the proactive periodization model.
Yeah, just to add on the second bit you were talking about there, Josh. I think I'm along the same lines for the most part. Like you want to find that base training cycle that kind of in general is going to have a hypertrophy focus period and a strength focus period that's going to be somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks in length or something like that. I think I view it pretty much like you said. I don't really view like an additional hypertrophy block as like part of that training cycle that I'm individualizing, if that makes sense. Like occasionally, like after a meet, or if like somebody just genuinely just wants to do a pretty non-specific period, I kind of put that in there, and like that is kind of separate, if that makes sense. Now, of course, that's going to have implications on the training cycle coming after it. That's clear, but yeah, that's not really part of my individualization unit, if that makes sense. That's kind of how I view it. And similarly, if you want to, sometimes just to, especially because some of my clients are cool with being guinea pigs, I'll do like an additional low fatigue strength block, like something we've written about a ton and say pretty much every time we talk about this stuff is that we are confident this applies in the short to moderate term. We say that all the time. And part of that is because training studies are not very long. The other half of it is in our anecdotal experience, there just seems to be a wall where this low fatigue stuff, especially for strength, just seems to not have the same magic anymore. And so occasionally, just for pure curiosity and just this, if especially if a client responds very very well to a certain low fatigue block, for example, I'll throw another one in there. Again, not really part of that training cycle per se, but it's for other reasons, just to see, is this a phenomenon that can occur indefinitely if the dose is right and everything, or is this something that's a little bit shorter term, that kind of thing. And then it also can give you further insight into, like we've talked about before, kind of taking that unit of training that you have, which is like 12 weeks long, making it a little bit more hypertrophy-esque, where you bump everything down a little bit. The periodization components are the same throughout. You're just kind of bumping things down a bit. Or maybe if the strength block goes really well, you bump some things in the low fatigue perspective, or maybe in the hypertrophy block, whereas the first cycle you were taking some AMRAPs to an 8 RPE, maybe you're doing one session a week where you're doing low fatigue back offs in your comp squat, even in the hypertrophy block, just because that seemed to work really well in the strength block, something like that. But that was the first thing I want to say. The second thing I wanted to say, more related to the original question, was I think it's important to really define what we consider a significant change and what the person that is asking the question defines as a significant change, because that to me shapes this question a ton. A significant change to us is going to be more along the lines of adding training volume, changing frequency, significantly manipulating the programming composition, stuff like that. Whereas other people may consider like Josh said, a changing of like a hypertrophy slot exercise selection as a major change. Whereas to us, we think that's kind of a tool accomplishing a similar goal, and don't really view that as a significant change. So I think that's the bedrock of this question: is first and foremost, what do you consider a significant change? And then from there, how many of those are you making block to block? So I really think that's dependent on what you consider a significant change. Again, we're more along the lines of changing that overall training dose, which is going to be related to volume, frequency, proximity to failure, in big strokes things, and less so about hypertrophy, exercise selection, the training template, that kind of stuff, or the training weekly setup, whatever you want to call it, that kind of stuff. I think that is a little bit lower on our ladder, and we wouldn't consider that as big of a change in most cases. But that's
quick thing to add there. And I know, Zach, you didn't mean this, but I just want to make sure this is clear. The hypertrophy exercise selection stuff, to be very clear, I actually think that proper exercise selection for the individual of their hypertrophy slots can kind of make or break a training program. But what Zach is saying, if you have two hypertrophy slots that
exactly
check the boxes for that individual, they can be more or less interchangeable. And if you vary that from block to block, it's not
or like chest flies and that kind of stuff too. Like that, I would say that matters considerably less. But yes.
Yeah. So to kind of sum it up, I think I would say like why we're hesitant to really like lean into lean away from our proactive periodization model that I briefly outlined, is that because you need constraints in order to just make it not a free-for-all in the individualization process. But once you kind of understand the constraints, you can use some of your clients as guinea pigs if you think it's going to be a net positive for them in the end, right? Maybe we find that this individual can do the low fatigue strategies for 10 weeks and progress linearly. That's really good information to know. So I think we could probably wrap that question up there, unless you guys have anything to add. Cool. Do you guys want to just jump to number 5 on the outline here? Then we can put the other 2 in the bank for later episodes.
Sure.
Let's see, Zach, I'll throw this one at you. Okay, so this person says, when listening to you guys talk about low fatigue training, they don't think we talk a ton about the differences in individual responses as it pertains to low fatigue training. So they say, do you feel that the individuality of each lifter is not that big of a factor on how we will respond to low fatigue training? So basically, individualization and low fatigue training is what it comes down to.
Yeah, so this is a really, really good question. And I think the first thing to state up front is that obviously individualization occurs and there's extreme variability across individuals to a given training program. I would say, though, that there are some variables that we consider kind of just good training is good training, which But there's other variables that I do think are more susceptible to individualization, namely the total training dose, which we've talked quite a bit about, is that is going to vary a ton between people. And that's going to kind of be the culmination of all these variables that is going to ultimately lead to positive outcomes for the individual. But as far as, for example, let's take intensity, because I think that's the easiest example. I have a very, very hard time believing that on average, or in a very, very high percentage of individuals, that higher intensities are not better for strength gains. Now, if you look at it across a study, that might not always be the case. If you take a study where they compare 75% of 1RM, 80% of 1RM, 85 and 90% of 1RM, you might not see a completely dose response relationship in better strength gains. But I just have a very hard time believing that for the most part that relationship doesn't exist. I just think that the principle of specificity is really, really powerful. Now, where that can become individualized is, again, how that overall impacts the total training dose. If I have somebody training with higher intensities, that's not just a change to intensity. That's also a change to the total training stress that you're imposing on a person. That means, so for example, some person might be able to tolerate a minimal amount of work at 90%, so they can still benefit from the specificity that promotes, but it's really, really taxing. So that's going to limit the amount of total training stress that they can recover from and ultimately benefit. So it's just important to understand that all those pieces are kind of tied together. There are relationships that we do think exist, which low fatigue we think is part of that, in saying that in general, for a vast majority of people, limiting the intraset fatigue of your back off sets after being of a sufficient load is going to lead to better strength gains. Are there circumstances in which we have to make some modifications because of external variables? Absolutely. And there's definitely cases that the formula that we kind of come up for low fatigue training is going to vary a ton between individuals. For example, one of my clients, Patty, that I've talked a ton about, her training has looked vastly different than what I would make for like kind of a stock low fatigue training cycle. She can perform a ridiculous amount of repetitions at a given percentage of 1RM. She can recover from a ton of training volume, and she needs to train at, on average, higher RPEs than most people. So when I do a low fatigue training block, and I just put that in quotes for her, it's going to look different, but the concepts are still the same. I'm still going to probably decrease the average RPE over the course of her training cycle. It just might go from a 9 to a 7 or a 6 instead of maybe a more typical, average RPE around 7 or 8 in a hypertrophy block down to maybe that 4 RPE range in a strength block on her back offs. It's just kind of the entire thing, like we said in an earlier question, just got kicked slightly in that higher fatigue direction. So my answer is to say is individualization absolutely exists. But sometimes I do question the kind of the mental landscape around that concept, just to say that there are fundamentally magic protocols that work for certain individuals. I would probably put myself on the skeptical side of that argument, and I would probably just say from a physiological perspective, I have a hard time believing that certain things like that exist. However, the thing I want to be very clear to acknowledge is that psychology of training matters a ton. And that is where the individualization piece is really, really propagated, in my opinion, because you can take 90% of 1RM for somebody that by all indications of physiology should lead to better strength gains. But if they absolutely hate training with 90%, I do not care how much physiological sense that makes. It's probably going to suck. And that is something you can't ignore. So it's just combining those two factors of understanding physiology exists. There are certain patterns that we have to respect based on that. But psychology matters a ton, and the effort, intent, and adherence that you're going to have to your training based on subjective preference is ultimately going to kind of paint a box that you're going to have to put all of these training principles into to allow the individual to kind of express the optimal configuration of their training based on all of those things that I just discussed. But hopefully that wasn't too much of a rant. I want to be clear. I'm not an individualization skeptic, super hardcore, but I just think sometimes the way it's discussed isn't always spot on, if that's the best way to say it.
I don't want to speak for you, Zach, but I'm almost certain we agree on this. Definitely not individualization skeptics, because we are like, that's probably something we focus a ton of our time and attention on
100%.
in terms of, but just a difference in how we view it, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah.
Like, okay, Zach Robinson might do best when training in 65 to 75% of 1RM, whereas I might do best training in 75 to 85% of 1RM, but it's not an inherent response to 65 to 75% for you. It's because of the downstream effects of that
Exactly.
loading range for you based
Exactly.
on the overall training dose and the way you perceive that protocol and how you execute it, etc. So, Jake, I'll pass this to you in a second, but I have two things to say. Like, I think we're trying to reframe the individualization concept into like what actually matters, and like when the rubber hits the road, what is actually driving the individual's response, and how can we adjust those for an individual and help them find that formula for them that they can get repeatable results. Kind of my client Drake, he calls it his bread and butter training cycle. We've ran it like 3 or 4 times now. We've seen pretty.
Shout out Chief Beef.
Yeah, man, he's a beefy guy. Um, it's his bread and butter training cycle, right? Where we can reliably see a nice bump in his total every 12-week training cycle. So again, I just want to be very clear. Quite the opposite of individualization skeptics, but we're just trying to reframe it over what are the variables that are most important to individualize, and how do we get people to find that? And like, at what point are we proactively periodizing things, and what point are we reactively individualizing things? So I just want to add that clarifier. The last thing I would say, and this kind of ties back to one of the first questions we answered here, is that the nice thing about low fatigue protocols is there's almost less room for individualization in the protocols themselves, because if you give somebody 80% for triples, almost no one's going to be like failing those reps, because a large factor for individualization is reps performed at a given percentage of their 1RM. Like Zach said with his client Patty, who he needs to make some considerations for her. But if you're giving 10 different people 80% for triples, sure, some people might be 6 or 7 reps in reserve. Some people might be 3 reps in reserve on average, whatever. Point being, we're checking the boxes for all those individuals in that, nobody's having a massive reduction in velocity over the course of the set. And everybody's going to be at kind of that threshold for load at which a repetition kind of becomes a repetition in terms of hypertrophy and volume allocation. So that is kind of an inherent plus of the low fatigue protocols that I would keep in mind. So yeah, I think that's all I got. Jake, clean up the mess we made.
That's funny you said that, because that was exactly what I was gonna just kind of come in and just wrap it all into something that's a little bit easy to digest and maybe something actionable that people can take. Is that, like we've been talking about with all this stuff, like it's about the concept, right? And that low fatigue training is not a single at 8 and then 6 sets of 2 at RPE 4. Like, that's not low fatigue training. It's a concept, right? So, pulling from a lot of what Zach and what Josh just said, in terms, like, physiologically speaking, yes, we individualize, but it's within these constraints of what constitutes good training, right? But like, psychologically speaking, it's unlimited, right? So like, I completely agree with these guys that the individualization, psychologically speaking, like, that's where most of the individualization is coming from. And it sometimes it's also just about like the individual that you're working with, and what's the rest of their life like, right? Like, some people are very predictable, and it's like, exactly, like my client Jeremy he's on top of his sleep, his nutrition. He makes sure that he takes time to recover a little bit more if he needs to, if he's feeling beat up, right? And like, he is a machine and he's very predictable, whereas other people, it's a lot more fluid, and you got to be on your toes a little bit and be ready to individualize, quote unquote, even more. So there's so many moving parts within just the human element of all this. So I think that's just the thing that I wanted to stress. Whereas the physiological stuff, the training dose and all of that, like, yes, it's individual, but it's within these certain constraints of what we know is probably a good idea.
Thanks so much, Josh.
I just want to echo what Jake was saying about the psychology bit there, where like, some people so I talked about finding your bread and butter training cycle. Um, I work with a guy named JJ who's a very strong dude, um, and we just finished our second training cycle together, and we've put, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but a good amount on his total. We've both been quite pleased with the progress. And training cycle 1 and training cycle 2 were quite similar to each other because training cycle 1 was very productive, right? So we only made some small changes. And after training cycle 2, I'm like, hey man, you want to do like a week or two of kind of like some pivot work where we pull back a little bit and kind of reset psychologically. He's the type of dude that's like, no, I'm ready to get back to it. I'm ready to get back to SBD work. Whereas other people, they can't necessarily do that. And that's not good or bad. It's just taking the context of the individual. So I've definitely noticed that there's a wide variety in terms of that kind of characteristic among individuals. So all right, that was actually a really fun episode. That was probably the most fun I've ever had recording a podcast episode. So we will. Zach just dropped his mic for people because you guys can't see this. All right, we'll wrap it up here. Quick reminder that there is a link to a Google form in the description, whether you're on a podcast player or on YouTube, to drop some questions. Apologies, there's more questions than we can answer, but if you put it in there, and it'll kind of be in our question bank, and maybe we'll answer it one of these days. So apologies if we haven't gotten to your question, but you can still drop it down there. And
you can blame Josh because he took us down a million tangents today.
Yeah, that's my bad, guys.
Drop a Josh sucks in the reviews,
okay,
please.
Man, for all 2 people that made it to the end. Okay, so if you think we're deserving, go ahead and drop a rating and review on whatever podcast player you use. Like it on YouTube, whatever you have time for, that'd be very much appreciated. You share it with a friend or 2. Again, if you think we're deserving. If you think there's something we can improve, if you have any, pointed feedback, feel free to DM any of us. We're more than happy to chat, and we definitely want to hear the feedback. So yeah, thanks for making it to the end of the episode, and take care.